It was a cloudy afternoon with a light drizzle, the kind of weather that makes you want to call it a day early and curl up somewhere warm. I was driving a lonely stretch of highway in Montana, headed west towards Idaho. The rain wasn't heavy, but it was just enough to make the road slick and the sky gray. The kind of afternoon where you feel like you're the only person on Earth. I had been on the road for hours without seeing another soul. Just me, my rig, and the empty highway stretching out in front of me. I wasn't expecting to pick up any hitchhikers, especially not in that weather, but as I rounded a bend, I spotted a figure standing by the side of the road. It was an old man, hunched over with a faded green jacket, his thumb sticking out. There was something off about him. Maybe it was the way he was standing, or the fact that he wasn't even trying to shield himself from the rain. He just stood there, staring ahead, like he'd been waiting for me. Normally, I wouldn't stop. It's not safe to pick up strangers, especially in the middle of nowhere, but something made me slow down. Maybe it was the look of desperation on his face or the way he seemed to appear out of nowhere. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" I called out. The old man nodded without saying a word and slowly made his way to the passenger side. He climbed in, his clothes soaked from the rain, and shut the door quietly. He didn't say thank you or even look at me, just stared straight ahead, clutching an old, worn-out book to his chest. I put the truck in gear and got back on the road. The rain picked up a little, tapping against the windshield like tiny fingers. For a while, we drove in silence. I glanced at him a couple of times, trying to size him up. His face was wrinkled, and his eyes were deep-set, shadowed by a gray cap he wore low over his forehead. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes meeting mine. There was something unsettling about his gaze, cold and distant, like he was looking right through me. Just a bit further up the road, he said in a low, gravelly voice, "I'll let you know where to drop me off." I nodded and kept driving. The rain was coming down harder now, and visibility was getting worse. The road signs were barely legible, and I was beginning to regret picking him up. The air inside the cab felt heavy, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I could see my breath misting in front of me, even though it was early fall and not particularly cold outside. As we drove on, the old man started talking. He spoke in a quiet, almost whispering tone, telling stories about his life, about roads he'd traveled and places he'd been. He mentioned towns I'd never heard of and highways that didn't exist anymore. There was a strange nostalgia in his voice, like he was reminiscing about a different time, a different world. At one point, he started telling me about a terrible accident that had happened on this very stretch of road. He described it in vivid detail, how a trucker had lost control in the rain, skidding off the road and crashing into a ditch. The truck had caught fire, and the driver was trapped inside. The old man spoke as if he had witnessed it himself, his eyes distant and glassy. "Did you see it happen?" I asked, feeling a shiver run down my spine. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window, watching the rain hit the glass. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was there," he said. "And so were you." A chill ran through me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I hadn't mentioned anything about myself, not where I was from, not what I did. How could he know that I had been a trucker on this road for years? I looked at him again, and this time, I noticed something I hadn't before, the way his jacket seemed dry now, despite the rain, and how his shoes didn't leave any wet prints on the floor mat. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The old man smiled, a slow, eerie smile that didn't reach his eyes. He reached down and opened the book he'd been holding. It was an old, leather-bound journal. He flipped through the pages, stopping at one that seemed well-worn. He held it up for me to see. My heart stopped when I saw the page. It had my name written at the top, followed by a date. Today's date. "This is your last journey, friend," he said softly. "It's time to join us." I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the wet road as I struggled to keep control. The cab filled with the sound of screeching tires and my own pounding heartbeat. When I finally managed to stop, I turned to confront him, but the passenger seat was empty. The old man was gone. All that was left was the book, lying open on the seat, pages fluttering in the breeze from the cracked window. I grabbed the book with trembling hands and looked at the page again. It was blank. My name was gone, as was the date. I threw it out of the window and floored the gas pedal, speeding away from that spot as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest truck stop, where I parked and jumped out, my heart still racing. I never saw that old man again, but I've heard stories from other truckers about picking up a strange passenger on a rainy day. A man who seems to know everything about you, who tells stories of crashes and accidents with chilling accuracy. They say he's the last passenger you'll ever pick up before you meet your fate on the road. I've never picked up another hitchhiker since. And whenever it starts raining on a lonely highway, I can't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see him sitting there, waiting to finish our journey together. This happened a few years ago during one of those long-haul trips that seem endless. I had set off from Minnesota with a delivery bound for Canada, fully loaded with goods that had to be there on time. It was around 2 a.m., and I found myself on a desolate secondary road winding through rural, mountainous areas. It was pitch dark, with no moonlight, and the only source of illumination was my truck's headlights cutting through the blackness ahead. I noticed I barely had any cell signal, which was typical for these remote stretches. After several hours of continuous driving, the fatigue started to creep in. I was on the edge of stopping to rest, but with no rest areas or gas stations in sight, I decided to push through a little longer. The road was eerily quiet, not a single car had passed by in over an hour. Just then, my phone rang. It startled me because I hadn't seen any sign of reception, and the number on the screen was unknown. Despite the odd timing, I answered, figuring it could be an emergency from the company or someone trying to reach me urgently. When I picked up, there was silence at first, just a crackling of static. I thought it might be a bad connection or a misdial, but then I heard it, a voice on the other end, faint and distorted. It was a man's voice, barely a whisper, but filled with desperation.
"Help me, please. I need help."
The voice was so weak that I had to strain to hear it. My first thought was that maybe someone had been in an accident nearby, but as I scanned the dark road, I didn't see any signs of a crash or broken down vehicle. I tried to stay calm and asked the man who he was and what had happened, hoping to get some kind of explanation.
"I don't have much time. I'm trapped."
His words were barely audible, breaking up with static, as if he were struggling to speak. I pressed him for more details, asking where he was and what had happened. But all I could hear were faint sobs and the sound of labored breathing. It was as if he were choking back tears. Then, without warning, the call dropped. I looked at my phone in disbelief. I tried calling back immediately, but the line wouldn't connect. The screen simply displayed number unavailable, as if the call had never existed. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It made no sense to get a call in the middle of nowhere, especially one so desperate. I decided to keep driving, though I found myself glancing at the rearview mirror more than usual. It felt like something, or someone, was out there, watching me. About an hour later, I spotted the faint glow of a small gas station in the distance. Relieved, I pulled in, figuring I could grab a coffee and maybe ask around if anyone had heard about an accident or seen anything strange that night. The station was almost deserted except for a couple of parked cars and an older man behind the counter who looked half asleep. I grabbed a coffee and struck up a conversation with him, mentioning the bizarre call I had received. The man looked up at me, his face suddenly serious. He took a long drag of his cigarette before speaking. "This road has a history," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing. "About 15 years ago, a trucker vanished here. He was making the same route as you, around the same time of year. The last anyone heard from him was a phone call to his wife. He sounded panicked, said he was lost, and that someone was following him. They never found him or his truck." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe the guy was pulling my leg, but the look in his eyes was dead serious. I told him about the call I had received, the desperation in the voice asking for help. The gas station attendant took a deep breath and shook his head. "You're not the first to hear that voice," he murmured, almost to himself. "I've had other drivers come in here over the years with the same story. It's always the same, a call for help from a man who sounds like he's in his final moments." I could feel my pulse quicken. This wasn't just a creepy story, something felt deeply wrong. I decided it was time to leave. I thanked the attendant, got back in my truck, and continued my drive, now wide awake with adrenaline. I kept the radio low and my eyes glued to the mirrors, expecting something to appear in the darkness behind me. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, and as I drove, the feeling of being watched never left. I kept checking my phone, almost hoping the call would come again so I could get some closure or a clearer understanding of what had happened. But there was nothing, no missed calls, no notifications. Just the empty, dark road and the hum of my engine. I finally made it to my destination at sunrise, exhausted but grateful to be in the light of day. After I finished the delivery and had some time to rest, I checked my phone again. There, in the call log, was a record of the incoming call. But instead of a phone number, it just showed a series of zeros and the words "unknown number." It felt like a cold confirmation that what I experienced wasn't a dream. To this day, I can't drive that route without thinking about that night. I've heard from other truckers who had similar experiences. Some say they felt a presence in the cab with them, others heard whispers through their radios. I don't know if it was the ghost of that missing trucker or something else entirely. But whatever it was, it felt real enough to leave me shaken. Now, whenever I drive through that stretch of road, I keep my phone within reach, bracing myself for the possibility that the call might come again. This happened to me about 5 years ago, while I was driving through the Midwest on a long haul from Illinois to Colorado. It was one of those stretches of road where you feel like you're the only person for miles. The sky was overcast, the air was heavy, and the flatlands stretched endlessly on either side. I was about 200 miles from the nearest town, just a barren strip of highway and the hum of my engine to keep me company. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided to flip on the CB radio. I wasn't expecting much chatter given how remote the area was, but I figured it might help me stay awake. I tuned into Channel 19, the typical trucker's channel, and listened for a few moments. It was mostly static, as I expected, until I heard a faint voice cut through. "Breaker, breaker, anyone got a copy?" The voice sounded strained, like the person was speaking from far away. I picked up my mic and responded. "This is Big Rig Joe. What's your 20? Over." I asked, expecting it to be another trucker who might have been stuck in the same quiet stretch as me. There was a pause, then the voice came through again, clearer this time. It was a man's voice, and it had a strange echo to it, almost like he was speaking from inside a tunnel. "I see you, Joe. You're on the lonely road tonight." I froze. The way he said my name was unsettling. I hadn't mentioned my handle in years, and even then, only a few drivers knew it. I gripped the mic tighter, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who is this?" I asked, my eyes scanning the empty road ahead. The only lights were from my own headlights cutting through the darkness. The radio crackled with static again, and for a moment, I thought I lost the signal. Then the voice returned, softer this time. "You're getting close now. Just a few more miles, and we'll be here waiting for you." I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what he meant by "we," but something about his tone made my skin crawl. I looked into my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but the road was empty. I decided not to respond and instead kept driving, focusing on the highway. For the next half hour, the CB radio was silent, and I started to convince myself that it was just some prankster messing around. Maybe another trucker was bored and decided to have some fun. But as I was passing a sign that read Devil's Fork, 5 miles, the radio came back to life. "Almost there, Joe. We've been waiting a long time." The voice was different this time. It sounded like a woman, soft and almost soothing, but with an undercurrent of something sinister. My heart raced. I had never told anyone about this route, and there was no reason anyone would be expecting me in the middle of nowhere. I picked up the mic again, trying to keep my composure. "Who the hell is this? Stop playing games." The woman's voice faded into the static, replaced by a low, rumbling laugh that sounded like it came from multiple voices at once. I slammed the radio off, my hand shaking. I didn't need this kind of nonsense when I was already running on fumes and caffeine. I drove for a few more minutes when the engine of my truck suddenly sputtered, and I felt the power flicker. The lights on my dashboard dimmed, and the engine cut out completely. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, the silence deafening. I tried the ignition, but the truck wouldn't start. It was as if every ounce of power had been drained. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring out into the pitch-black night. The only sound was the wind howling across the flatlands. Then, I heard it, the unmistakable crackle of the CB radio turning on by itself. It was impossible. The radio shouldn't have any power if the truck was dead. "We're here, Joe. Right behind you." The voice was a whisper now, right in my ear. I spun around in my seat, looking into the darkness behind the truck. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, 2 faint lights appeared in the distance, slowly getting closer. They weren't headlights, they were too small, almost like the glow of eyes. They flickered, brightening and dimming, as if they were blinking. I felt a wave of cold air fill the cab, and I could see my breath misting in front of me, despite it being a warm night. The lights got closer, and I could make out shadowy figures in the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping out onto the gravel. The figures were gone, but I could still feel eyes on me, watching. The CB radio crackled again, the laughter returning, this time louder, almost mocking. I climbed back into the cab and slammed the door, frantically trying the ignition one last time. The engine roared to life as if nothing had happened. I floored it, speeding down the highway, not daring to look in my mirrors. I didn't stop until I reached the next truck stop, a good 50 miles away. When I finally parked, I sat there for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were still shaking as I reached for the CB radio to turn it off, but it was already off. The power knob was in the off position, just as I had left it after the first call. I've talked to a few other drivers about that night since then. Some of them have heard strange voices on the CB in that area too, but most don't want to talk about it. There's a legend about Devil's Fork, something about a group of truckers who died in a fiery crash back in the 70s. They say their souls are trapped on that stretch of road, trying to reach out to the living, to warn them or maybe just to feel some connection one last time. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I stopped using the CB radio at night after that. I figured it was better to let the dead rest in peace and keep my ears open for the road ahead. And every time I pass by Devil's Fork, I can't help but glance at the radio, half expecting it to crackle to life again, with voices whispering my name from the other side.